Hi and welcome. I'm happy to present to you a new series of short lectures on narrative mediation. My name is Mark Frank. I'm a mediator with a master's degree in conflict resolution and a lawyer. And I must confess that I am in love with narrative mediation.
This piece is by Mark Frank and read by Automated Voices.
The reason I originally decided to explain the principles of narrative mediation to the public is simple. In my view, narrative mediation still hasn't gained the traction it deserves, especially not in Israel where I live. But before we tackle the obvious question, what's with this buzzword, narrative? Let's take a moment to prepare ourselves for a paradigm shift. The narrative paradigm offers a new way of looking at human nature, at how we communicate and how we interact with the world around us. The rationale paradigm most of us grew up with describes human beings as fundamentally rational actors. The narrative paradigm, by contrast, describes humanity as something else entirely. We are storytellers. So why describe human beings as storytellers? As written in this book, and I should note here that Gerald Monk and John Winslade are the inspiration for this series, we tell ourselves stories in order to give our lives a sense of continuity. Without stories, we would experience our timelines as nothing more than a series of random, meaningless events. And when we imbue that story with narrative properties, we create coherence, both about who we are in the present and about the person we can develop into later. And incidentally, the stories we tell ourselves are largely the same stories we tell others, stories designed to present us as coherent, reliable, and connected human beings. Think about how many everyday interactions we experience are structured as stories. When someone asks, "What's going on?" we often respond with a story. "How was your day?" invites a different kind of story. A witness on the stand answers the question, "What did you see?" with a story. And when we're reprimanded, we respond with a story, one that justifies our behavior. Which brings us to the core question: what does narrative mediation have to offer us? In the 1980s, a new term entered our lexicon, win-win. It came from the book Getting to Yes by Fisher and Urey, which laid out a roadmap for negotiation and conflict management and became a bestseller. In their approach, they set out 4 fundamental principles for conducting collaborative negotiations. But the most transformative principle was this: the core issues in a negotiation should no longer be the adversarial positions the parties bring to the table. Instead, we should lift the veil on those positions and reveal what lies beneath them, the needs, desires, concerns, and fears of each side. I accept that the intentions of classical mediation are noble, but here's the problem. In conflict, our feelings are usually hurt along the way. It's all very well to say that getting to yes guides us to recognize and understand emotions, our own and those of the other side. But most of us are not clinical psychologists. When confronted with pain and anger, whether expressed through aggression or emotional withdrawal, most of us become awkward. We sit there, dazed and confused. For mediators, it's often easier to minimize emotional outbursts, put them in parentheses, and move on, rather than excavating them as a resource. And this is where narrative mediation has something powerful to offer, even without clinical training, not only for mediators, but for everyday life. So, okay, all well and good. It's fairly easy to understand why the narrative paradigm sees human beings as storytellers. But how does that help us understand narrative mediation? And how does it help us navigate daily life? Let me try to show you. And how else but through a story? This is a story about my father. We're going back to the 1950s, to a distant place, Australia. At the time, my father was a new immigrant. He barely knew how to read or write. Like most of his circle of friends, he worked in a niche career, wool buying. Every Monday, he would drive hundreds of miles to remote shires, places like Dalwallinu or Perenjori, somewhere in the northern wheat belt of Western Australia. There, he would negotiate with the farmers in his Polish accent until he'd return home in his truck on Thursday night. Over his stay there, he would call his boss every evening from a public phone to report on his progress and receive instructions. His boss would update him on market conditions at the central wool auctions in the capital city and give him a price range within which he was authorized to negotiate. One evening, Dad received instructions reflecting a rather depressed market with low prices. The next day, following those instructions, he closed a deal with a farmer for the farmer's entire wool clip. Hundreds of bales at a relatively low price. But that same evening, when my father returned to the country hotel and called his boss again, everything had changed. A war had broken out on the other side of the globe. Overnight, the market soared. Suddenly, the wool my father had purchased could be sold at the central market for far more than anyone had anticipated. Dad hesitated. What would happen when the farmer heard the wool market reports on the radio? Would he feel cheated? How would he react to all this? Dad knew he had acted in good faith, but what story would the farmer tell himself? My father resolved the dilemma by driving back to the farm the next day. He wrote the farmer a personal, generous check for thousands of Australian pounds and said, "Sure, I meant to make a profit from the deal, but not that much." Now imagine my father telling this story around the Shabbat table, surrounded by family. He would likely be met with empathy. But change the setting. Imagine him telling the same story at a card table with a bunch of his friends, the air full of smoke, sleeves rolled up, stripped down to their singlets, and among them, one of his competitors. It's easy to imagine that rival throwing the story back at him with contempt, calling him a coward and a sucker. All this without changing a single fact in the plot. Alternatively, let's fast forward to decades later to my parents' living room. The same friends, but dressed neatly, no smoke, sitting comfortably, regaling stories, and sharing early career notes from the 1950s. My father would tell the same story about the personal check, but now adding how this story spread like wildfire across the length and breadth of the rural district, and how it constituted the turning point in his career. Because that's how he earned the trust of the community, how, overnight, he was transformed from a kind of itinerant peddler into a reliable, professional, respected business associate, someone you could do business with. That's how he became part of the rural community, one of the most successful wool buyers in the field. He didn't need to explain to his friends that this is how he supported his family with dignity for decades, or that, like them, he went on to live a comfortable life in the comfortably middle-class suburbs of Australia. What I wanted to show with this story is not only how storytelling creates continuity across a life's timeline or coherence of identity, it's that every story contains elements the storyteller downplays or hides and elements they highlight. This isn't deception. Every story is a selection from a pool of available plot events. From the same story about my father, one could portray him as a fool or as a successful agent. All the literary elements of these different versions already exist in the storyteller's conceptual story folder. Each of us is the producer, director, and screenwriter of our own story. Depending on our needs, we choose what to emphasize and what to conceal. Why? Because only by assembling the right pieces can we create a coherent story. From the perspective of narrative mediation, unlike courtroom litigation, these are not contradictions that invalidate one version and confirm another. They are parts of a single, broader, multi-layered story, far more complex than what coherence allows the storyteller to present while standing under a spotlight, trying to hold an audience's attention. Even in everyday life, we constantly stage and script our narratives. We decide which elements move to center stage and which recede into the background, depending on the context. The story we tell our family will differ from the one we tell at the card table. In the upcoming videos, we'll dig deeper into our story folders and explore how changing a conflict's narrative might lead us toward a different destination altogether from that our conflict story may be leading us to. So, stay with us and click through to the next video in the series further along into this journey. This is Narrative Mediation's guide for the perplexed, where we learn to change the stories we live in.